Hi everyone, Jason here from spiritualbabes.net. We are joined by Rabbi Joshua Neely, and we are on Esther chapter 8. You can see all of the previous, or hear all of the previous podcasts on this by looking at the little question mark that pops up, and there'll be a link under the video. And at the end of the video, and there's also going to be a link to go over to Rabbi Neely's channel and subscribe there. Don't forget to, because he puts out loads of good stuff every week. Thank you for walking us through this, Rabbi Neely.
Oh, my pleasure.
We are going to jump into chapter 8 straight away. In the end of the previous chapter, Haman came to a sticky, spiky end. And we are literally at that point in time. Haman's been killed. Esther and Mordecai in themselves are now safe. And I think the king is looking for a direction to move in. As we've learned from previous episodes, he wasn't great at making up his mind.
You're noticing that pattern, yes.
Okay, verse 1. That very day, King Ahasuerus gave the property of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, to Queen Esther. Mordecai presented himself to the king, for Esther had revealed how he was related to her. So this is awkward because we spoke at the beginning of this series how Mordecai and Esther's relationship may have been a little bit colourful, in that there's a conception that he's sort of an uncle, but then we also found out that maybe she's sort of a partner.
It is a little ambiguous in places, but what is important here is that this could have been a big problem. When he finds out that Esther is related to Mordecai, and given the sort of collusion that's happened between them, that could have gone south very quickly. It's like, well, wait a minute, why didn't you tell me initially that you guys were connected one to another? But instead, Ahasuerus, being the very suggestible man that he is, follows their lead and seems to be perfectly fine with what's happening.
And so he wasn't worried at all that there was any kind of conspiracy.
Right.
Yeah. The king slipped off his ring, which he had taken back from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther put Mordecai in charge. of Haman's property.
So you're noticing some things now. Yes.
Because
go ahead. Yeah.
Because up to that point, the women were always separate. The king was the king, and at the beginning, his first favorite, if you like, tried to make a decision, and that didn't go well at all. But now here is Esther dividing up Haman's goods.
Exactly. Remember, Esther was the one who gave instructions to Mordecai about how the Jews of the city were to prepare. And in the previous chapter, when Haman is becoming terrified, he's not only terrified of the king, but also the queen. And now we're seeing that Esther is stepping forward to be the one who is officially putting Mordecai in charge of the estate. I mean, she's the one who is distributing the spoils, if you will, and the status that was once Haman's is now being given to Mordecai. So, yes, the king still has a role with the ring and the symbol that goes behind that, but essentially Esther is becoming an actual ruling queen, as opposed to what we saw from Vashti, who was gotten rid of because it seemed like the king didn't want a ruling queen. So it's come full circle, and the king's ended up with a queen that is more powerful than the one he got rid of.
Okay. Esther spoke to the king again, falling at his feet and weeping and beseeching him to avert the evil plotted by Haman the Agagite against the Jews. Because, if you don't remember, Haman had a huge plan to wipe out all of the Jews, not just Mordecai, although Mordecai was I think he was kind of hiding Mordecai's murder amongst a much bigger tragedy.
Exactly. And so the idea here is to, she wants to overrule, to rescind what he was planning to do. And that's going to be now a topic of bureaucratic intricacy in the next few verses.
The king extended the golden scepter to Esther, and Esther arose and stood before the king. If it please your majesty, she said, "and if I have won your favor, and the proposal seems right to your majesty, and if I am pleasing to you, let dispatches be written countermanding those which were written by Haman, son of Hammedetha, the Agite, embodying his plot to annihilate the Jews throughout the king's provinces. For how can I bear to see the disaster which will befall my people, and how can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred?"
Good question, right? So she wants that to be rescinded, right? For it to be overruled, the idea that had been sent out. But the king is now going to have to answer, but he's going to have to do it within the structure of what was already sent out.
Right. Yeah, because he can hardly say, actually, Haman managed to do quite a lot behind my back and played me for a fool. And now I've got a favourite lady and she wants this. He has to make it look, it still has to come from the king and be the king's idea. When then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, "I have given Haman's property to Esther, for he has been impaled on the stake for scheming against the Jews." Is that why he was impaled on the stake?
So it's how do we put this? It may have been the immediate cause, or it may have not been, or it may have been the more distant cause. Clearly, if he had not had his scheme, he would not have ended up impaled.
True.
On the other hand, the king did not seem to think that the scheme against the Jews was a problem, since he had approved it in the first place. On the other hand, the king is now making a speech, which means any relationship between the words he utters and reality is purely coincidental, like any politician. So what he may be trying to, pardon the expression, stake out here is that he was never an ally of Haman's for the slaughter of the Jews. That had never been, in his mind, right, what was supposed to be happening, because he would never allow one of his functionaries to have wholesale slaughter against one of the subject people of his empire. Again, going back to the very delicate nature of the multi-ethnic Persian Empire. So the king may be trying to publicly distance himself from what Haman was trying to do, and saying that was why he was doing it, not just because it ended up affecting his own house, but otherwise he would have allowed it to keep going on just fine.
"And you may further write, with regard to the Jews as you see fit," and I've got in little brackets here, "write it, in the king's name and seal it with the king's signet, for an edict that has been written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet may not be revoked." So he's given them kind of a blank check there.
He's giving them a blank check. I mean, that's the whole, do what's right in your eyes, as the Hebrew literally says. But it's also not exactly the word rebuke, but a limitation. Because he's just told her he won't do what she asked, but instead is giving her an alternative. So she asked for there to be a revocation of Haman's decree. And he's just said, "I can't revoke it, because I was signed with my signet. And it is not appropriate for any edict that was sent out with the king's signet to be revoked." And so we'll find out as the chapter goes on, and then we get more and more of what happens in the aftermath, that Haman's original plan was never rescinded. Haman's original law was never rescinded. Instead, Esther is going to write a parallel edict that will not stop what Haman was planning to do, but will blunt the damage of what Haman was going to do.
Okay. So the king's scribes were summoned at that time on the 23rd day of the third month, that is, the month of Sivan, and the letters were written at Mordecai's dictation to the Jews and to the satraps, the governors and the officials of the 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. Does it say India to Ethiopia?
It says the words that are generally recognized as referring to India and Ethiopia, okay. But it's a little more. Sometimes people argue about exactly what Hodu and Kush mean, but that is fairly widely accepted as being the correct translation and is appropriate. I mean, that is roughly the area that Persia did rule.
Okay. To every province in its own script, and to every people in its own language, and to the Jews in their own script and language. he had written in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed with the king's signet. Letters were dispatched by mounted couriers riding steeds used in the king's service, bred of the royal stud. So literally couriers going out to every township, to every leader, to every village with a new law. I see what you mean about the revocation. If there's a rule that if the signet and the signature is on the letter, it has to be done. You only have to say that that's not the case for one of them, and suddenly any respect for that form of signature is lost, because it's going to be, well, he says we have to do everything the signature's on, but now we don't, because that kind of tradition is broken.
Especially when you're dealing with long distance travel. I mean, yes, this verse points out in verse 10 that everything was being sent out very quickly, but quickly in the days of yore is not quickly like today with a quick email or text message. So it was going to take time, and therefore you had to rely on the document that was presented as being legit and irrevocable, or else you could be in real trouble. It also was, by the way, meant to be as a warning to administrators, kings in particular, that they shouldn't make an edict that they're not prepared to stand behind.
Okay. To this effect,
there's also, I'm sorry, I don't know how much philosophy or theology you want to go down, but there's also a sort of parallel notion here. This idea of a king's edicts not being revoked is very much a liturgical theme that comes up over and over again in Jewish prayer, of the idea that the commandments that God has given to us are never to be revoked, right? There is no updated version coming down the pike. Or else people would say, well, I know God told us to do this, but I'm not sure whether he really meant it or meant it for all time. Maybe he's canceled it by now, right? And Judaism is very, very explicit that the commandments that God gave us are the commandments that God expects us to keep in every place and every time.
I've heard that argument a few times.
I thought you might have.
Okay. To this effect, the king has permitted the Jews of every city to assemble and fight for their lives. If any member or province attacks them, they may destroy, massacre, and exterminate its armed forces together with women and children, and plunder their possessions on a single day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, namely on the 13th day of the 12th month, that is, the month of Adar. So they've been given the right to not only defend themselves, but to physically and violently attack and kill anyone that comes near them. That surely would be enough to put most people off.
And yet we'll find out that it didn't.
Okay.
But notice as well the end of verse 11, where it says that the Jews will be allowed to take the spoils, to take the plunder. All right, so hold that in your mind as we go forward and see what happens when the fight comes.
The text of the document was to be issued as a law in every single province. It was to be publicly displayed to all of the peoples, so that the Jews should be ready for that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. To avenge themselves on their enemies. Are we talking about two different dates? Or am I misreading the word? To avenge someone is after the fact.
Well, that's... So, lehinakim, the term that's used here, is the word that's used for vengeance. It's the word that's used for jealousy. When we say that God is a, quote, jealous God, it's the same root word that's being used.
Okay.
So you might use it as being more of passionately defensive of what is theirs.
All right.
Which is really what the sense God is a jealous God means as well. It doesn't mean that, God sits around going, I can't believe that he has a new car and I don't.
The couriers mounted on royal steeds went out in urgent haste at the king's command, and the decree was proclaimed in the fortress Shushan. Mordecai left the king's presence in royal robes of blue and white, with a magnificent crown of gold and a mantle of fine linen and purple wool, and the city of Shushan rang with joyous cries. Now, that kind of dictates to me, or gives a picture to me of how many Jews there would have been in the city. It's not just a minority. If the city was ringing out with...
Well, yes and no, because as we're going to see when we get especially into verse 17, that there may have been more well-wishers than you might imagine. But even if we don't take that into account, the fact is that the different ethnicities of Persia were already very worried about this idea of the Agagite being able to exterminate an entire other ethnicity. That's not a precedent you really want to have reinforced. And indeed, this was a constant struggle within the Persian Empire, and one that caused a great deal of strife. So the idea that, and sorry, back up again, and you probably also remember that when Haman first issued the edict and there was a feast with the king and him, and they sat down drinking, the entire city was like, what? There was a sense of incredulity at the beginning. And so now you can understand why there is a national sense of relief when it has been now abated.
And Mordecai as well. I mean, when we started, Mordecai was, it's quite an increase in his stature.
Yes, he has definitely risen in the ranks.
The Jews enjoyed light and gladness, happiness and honor. That's a very beautiful, descriptive line. The use of light, they enjoyed light. It's very poetic.
In fact, it's so poetic that we recite it at every Havdalah.
Oh, fantastic. I know nothing.
It's a line that we couldn't let just go for, only a couple times a year.
That's great.
Every week.
And in every province and in every city, when the king's command and decree arrived, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many of the people of the land professed to be Jews, for the fear of the Jews had fallen upon them.
So the phrase mityahadim is an interesting one. So this translation that you're reading is the idea that they professed to be Jews. The traditional read of it, of course, is that they converted. That they actually chose to become Jewish because they recognized in all of this the amazing way that God had delivered these people, and that kind of God was the sort of God you probably wanted to be following, because that was the real deal. But it's just also a great grammatical word, because midyahadim is basically they Jewed themselves.
Oh, really?
And it comes from the word Yehuda, right, from the word for Jew. So it's just kind of a really neat verb being turned out of the description word, Jew.
But it does read as if they were terrified that on this particular day, you're walking down the street and you accidentally trip over. It's on this day, and the guy walking opposite to you is Jewish. And you're thinking, oh my God, he might think I'm going to mug him, and now he's going to kill me and take all my stuff. So you raise your hands and you say, I'm Jewish, don't worry about it. I wasn't doing anything bad. So it's kind of what it feels like it's saying, for the fear of the Jews had fallen upon them. I wonder if there was a certain amount of hiding. That's what it feels like in the plain reading of it.
Well, so there's probably also a not illegitimate fear that the Jews will do to the rest of the country what Haman was trying to do to them. That, there is a natural fear that if somebody has been targeted and oppressed and under danger of death, that once they are released, they're going to want to take vengeance. They're going to want to get their own back. They're going to want to, abuse others. Maybe the people who were trying to abuse them, or maybe just other people, because, hey, that's what you do when you're in power. You smash around the weak so you can take their stuff. And so the idea that the Jews might do the same would have been a natural political concern for all the people of the Persian Empire. And for some people, the conclusion might have been, well, I guess we might as well be Jewish then, if that's what the rising political party is.
Well, that's the end of 8. And we are done for this show. You guys can catch us again next time. There's only 2 more, and then we'll have finished Esther. If you've got recommendations as to where you'd like us to go next, or a subject or a book, let us know. Thank you very much, Rabbi Neely, for your time today.
Always my pleasure. It's just a wonderful, wonderful book.
And you guys can see that there's a little link on the page now to go over to Rabbi Neely's